Hi again, John Nielsen here with Wing Chun Hall, and this is probably my final installment in my series of videos on Joe Rogan's comments on Kung Fu. Since the first video in this series, people's comments have shown me that some people feel Kung Fu means Wing Chun. This is a problem of all A's are B's, but not all B's are A's. It's more useful to say Wing Chun is a very big fish in a huge Kung Fu ocean, or Wing Chun is a big giant tree cluster in a very big Kung Fu forest. For example, the statement maple syrup comes from trees is true, but it doesn't mean you can get maple syrup from a pine tree. Likewise, when Joe says something about Kung Fu, he might be right in general, but still wrong about Wing Chun and other types of Kung Fu. So let's hear what he says.
In Taekwondo, we used to have the things called one steps. And what it is, you would throw a kick and the other guy would counter. And what it was is to imprint into your mind what to do once you start sparring. And then eventually you start sparring.
One steps are drills in which your partner executes a known attack and holds a pose so that you can respond to that attack. Obviously, Wing Chun trains with one steps, and you can keep on adding responses until it becomes absurd. However, let's go back to our maple tree analogy. We know you can only get maple syrup from a maple tree, but not every maple tree will give you maple syrup. Only mature black or sugar maples yield syrup, and then only in a good year. Likewise, each Wing Chun school is different, and what can be said about one school cannot with certainty be said of another. So most Wing Chun schools use one steps, but not all are ridiculous about it. But that can't be Joe's issue, because Joe currently practices Jiu-jitsu, and this video clearly shows Jiu-jitsu schools use one steps. So let's keep going.
But when you start sparring, that's when techniques really get weeded out, and that's when you understand what is the most effective use of energy and force, what techniques work the best, what techniques are really truly applicable, and what techniques are really kind of frivolous and a waste of time. There's better alternatives.
According to Joe, sparring is the next level and superior to one steps in its realism. But what is sparring? Webster says sparring is a form of fighting practice. So any type of fighting practice, including competitions, is sparring. And different disciplines spar in different ways. Wrestling has its form of sparring, boxing has its form of sparring, karate has its form of sparring, judo has its form of sparring, taekwondo has its form of sparring, jiu-jitsu has its form of sparring, Muay Thai has its form of sparring, and sumo has its form of sparring, and of course MMA has its form of sparring too. Obviously different disciplines spar differently, but most fall into two general categories, strikers and grapplers. However, just as in any catalog system, not every item falls neatly into the general categories. Perhaps this is the source of the error. If something doesn't look like the sparring you're familiar with, you may not recognize it. Joe has more to say.
Well, Kung Fu never did that. They didn't have all the sparring.
This statement may be a case if it's true for some trees, but not for all trees. I'm not a general Kung Fu expert, but I do know that Tai Chi has its form of sparring called push hands, and Wing Chun has its form of sparring called Chi Sao, and they don't fit neatly into the general sparring categories. It seems that other predominantly hand arts prefer to spar in or outside of kicking range, which doesn't make sense to us. We've observed that unless both parties have agreed to combat, most fights start in punching range. In other words, if one person doesn't want to fight, the other person who does want to fight usually gets close enough to punch or grab the unwilling fighter. So that's where we spar. Maybe Joe didn't recognize Chi Sao as sparring because it's unlike other forms of sparring, and if so, he can't really be blamed because even some Wing Chun guys don't understand that Chi Sao is sparring. Several Wing Chun guys, along with other Kung Fu guys, are copying boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai, and MMA sparring. I don't know if that's necessary for other forms of Kung Fu, and if you know, please leave a comment or a link. But certainly, it isn't necessary for Wing Chun. We have our sparring games, and they're suited to our training goals. So maybe Joe is right about some Kung Fus, but not about Wing Chun.
They didn't have Kung Fu didn't go and enter into an Ultimate Fighting Championship where it was public and everybody figured it out.
Okay, this statement is simply untrue of Kung Fu in general. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the Jinwu Association and later the Central Wushu Institute, in an attempt to unify the Chinese martial arts, sponsored tournaments all over China. Ip Man fought and won in these tournaments. 1950s Hong Kong was home to an unsanctioned, unregulated underground fighting competition called Beimo. Many arts participated, but there were two notable highly successful Wing Chun practitioners, namely Lung Sheng and Wang Shenlong. Then in the 70s, people came from all over the world to Hong Kong to participate in televised games. Ron Van Cleef, an eclectic martial artist with Wing Chun training, participated and won in these tournaments, so Joe's statement simply isn't historically accurate. Kung Fu did participate in competitions, and those competitions were often more no-holds-barred than any MMA fight. It's more accurate to say that Kung Fu never went through the sports transformation process until recently. In the early 20th century, many Asian martial arts transformed their self-defense disciplines into sports in an effort to stay relevant. That didn't happen to the Chinese martial arts until recently with Sanda. That doesn't mean we don't play sparring games. The difference is in Kung Fu, we play games as part of training to fight. In sports combat, the game is the goal.
Out, and it was spread out through the internet, so there's debate amongst all the minds of different martial artists, whether they're kickboxers or wrestlers. There's a genuine consensus when it comes to mixed martial arts.
Consensus is a question of opinion, not of fact, and I disagree with Joe's opinion of consensus in the MMA. I've observed that different fighters use different strategies, and effective strategies change when the rules change. On the other hand, if he's implying that there isn't consensus in the Kung Fu world, and by extension in Wing Chun, then I have to agree with him. But that's not because there hasn't been debate, and that's a question of fact. Before there was the internet, the debate was carried out in books, magazines, audio, and videotapes. Since at least the 1950s, Wing Chun has always been a very big part of that debate. Today, Wing Chun is still all over the internet, and there is still debate, but there is no consensus. That's partly because we don't all play exactly the same game. Most Wing Chun schools have Chi Sao, but the rules of Chi Sao are flexible. The benefit of having flexible rules is that you get to negotiate your preferences each time you play. The drawback is that play doesn't transfer well between schools, so we don't play well together. Wing Chun wasn't really designed for games, it was designed for the battlefield. That doesn't mean that Wing Chun hasn't been involved in sports, though. There are tournaments going on all over the world, and Wing Chun guys enter those tournaments and often win. That means that you have to play somebody else's game, which is always a handicap, but they still win. Another reason for the lack of consensus is Wing Chun's outdated method of organization modeled after lineage societies. The idea is that the founder of the discipline is akin to a patriarch, and everyone who practices the art belongs to their family. The problem is that loyalty to a lineage society is a foreign concept to most modern practitioners, and even some native Chinese have trouble staying loyal. If they have difficulty with some other member, they just go off and start their own lineage society, and all of their students become involved in a family feud. Consequently, there is no universally recognized central organizing body in the Wing Chun community. This is a problem since all of Yip Man's surviving students, leaders of lineage societies, are now in their 80s and 90s and won't be around much longer. When they go, people's loyalties will go with them. And since we're not likely to organize around a game, we'll have to find something else to organize around or be dispersed. Maybe Joe's right about that.
Kung Fu guys, that's what I have the problem with. The Kung Fu guys react. They do techniques, they practice techniques as if the other person isn't going to react.
Finally, we get to the heart of Joe's trouble with Kung Fu. He says Kung Fu acts as though the other person isn't going to respond. Now, I've already shown that through Chi Sao, this isn't true of Wing Chun, so I have to conclude that once again, Joe wasn't talking about Wing Chun. However, I would like to thank him for making comments that springboarded this discussion on Wing Chun, and if you'd like to enter the discussion, please feel free. However, let's make it a real debate. State your point, make your case. On the other hand, if you're just interested in empty accusations and name-calling, this is not the place for you. Find your own cyberspace. It's free. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.